Number 10. Basil II. Some rulers terrified history through spectacle, while others did so through something colder and, in some ways, more enduring. Discipline so relentless that an empire itself seemed to harden around their will. Basil II belongs to that darker category of imperial power. Byzantine emperor and one of the most formidable rulers of the medieval Eastern Roman world, he is remembered not only for military success, but for the severe force of his reign and the fear attached to his treatment of enemies. That is what gives him such lasting power. Basil did not survive in memory as a decadent tyrant or theatrical madman. He survived as something more controlled, and therefore in a different way more frightening, a ruler whose authority seemed stripped of softness. What makes Basil II so powerful in historical memory is the sense of compressed severity around his name. Some emperors dominate through charisma or pageantry. Basil's reputation is harsher. He appears as a sovereign of endurance, discipline, and vengeance, a ruler whose wars did not merely extend imperial influence, but communicated what happened when imperial patience ended. That is especially clear in the image history preserved of his treatment of defeated enemies, which became central to his legend and helped transform him into something more than a successful emperor. He became a warning about what Byzantine power could look like when embodied by a ruler who viewed weakness as a liability and mercy as strategically dangerous. That is why Basil remains haunting. His reign suggests one of history's most unsettling truths about monarchy. Fear does not always come from instability. Sometimes it comes from competence sharpened into ruthlessness. A ruler who is disordered can be hated or mocked, but a ruler who is organized, victorious, and willing to make punishment memorable becomes harder to resist psychologically. Basil's authority carried that weight. He did not merely wear the crown, he made it feel like the concentrated will of empire itself, focused through a man unusually difficult to move, manipulate, or soften. What keeps Basil II haunting is that he represents a form of kingship history often finds hardest to contain morally. He was not terrifying because he seemed incapable of rule. He was terrifying because he ruled too effectively for comfort, and because effectiveness under a crown can become merciless very quickly. In him, monarchy appears not as ceremony, but as endurance fused with retribution. That is why his name still carries a chill. He reminds history that some rulers do not need madness to inspire fear. They only need discipline, victory, and the willingness to let empire speak in the language of punishment. Number 9. King John. Some rulers terrified history because they conquered the world around them, but others became feared because they turned their own kingdom inward against itself. King John belongs to that second and more corrosive category of royal dread. As King of England in the early 13th century, he survives not merely as an unpopular monarch, but as one of the clearest examples of a ruler whose reign seemed to poison trust at every level. That is what gives him such enduring force. John is remembered not simply for losing lands, clashing with nobles, or provoking crisis, but for creating a climate in which power itself began to feel treacherous, vindictive, and unstable. What makes King John so powerful in historical memory is the atmosphere of suspicion surrounding him. Some rulers are feared because they dominate openly. John is feared because he appears in the record as a king whose use of power became intensely personal. Hostility, arbitrary pressure, financial exaction, political retaliation, and the erosion of noble confidence all gathered around his reign until kingship itself began to feel less like protection and more like predation. That is one of the darkest things a monarch can do. A kingdom can survive hardship, but once its elites, vassals, and subjects begin to believe the ruler cannot be trusted within the basic logic of rule, the crown becomes a source of instability rather than order. This is part of why John's memory became so dark. He was not merely unsuccessful. He seemed to embody the danger of a king whose insecurity and anger could become governmental style. That matters because fear in monarchy often comes less from isolated acts of cruelty than from the sense that there is no safe principle beneath them. Under such a ruler, today's ally may become tomorrow's target, law becomes leverage, and loyalty becomes a gamble. John's reign helped create exactly that impression, which is one reason it has remained so potent in political memory. The crisis that culminated in Magna Carta was not just constitutional, it was psychological. It reflected a kingdom trying to place limits around a crown it had come to fear. What keeps King John haunting is that he reveals one of history's most unsettling forms of rulership. The king who makes ordinary governance feel like a field of traps. He did not need imperial grandeur or legendary slaughter to terrify history. He only needed to make his own realm feel unsafe under his hand. That is why he remains unforgettable. In John, monarchy ceases to look majestic and begins to look suspicious, grasping and cornered, which is often when it becomes most dangerous to everyone around it. Number 8. Aurangzeb. Some rulers terrified history because they ruled through obvious chaos, but others did so through discipline, conviction, and a severity so sustained that an empire itself began to feel narrower under their hand. Aurangzeb belongs to that darker category of imperial power. As Mughal emperor, he inherited one of the richest and most sophisticated courts in the early modern world, yet his name survives not through splendor alone, but through the sense that under him sovereignty hardened into something more austere, more suspicious, and more willing to turn political authority into religious and military pressure. That is what gives him such enduring force. He was not remembered simply as a king on a throne. He was remembered as a ruler whose reign made empire feel stricter, heavier, and more feared. What makes Aurangzeb so powerful in historical memory is the contrast between inheritance and direction. He ruled an empire already immense, cultured, and administratively formidable, but his legacy carries the impression of contraction in spirit even where power expanded in territory. Campaigns, orthodoxy, political repression, and prolonged conflict all helped create the image of a sovereign who believed strength required hardening the state rather than balancing it. That matters because some rulers become frightening not by appearing unstable, but by appearing convinced. A ruler who doubts can be negotiated with. A ruler who believes history, religion, and empire all stand behind his severity becomes far harder to soften. His reputation also survives because later memory has treated him as a dividing line. For some, he represents devotion, endurance, and uncompromising rule. For others, he represents intolerance, pressure, and the beginning of imperial overstrain sharpened by ideological rigidity. That split is part of what keeps him haunting. A ruler becomes especially powerful in history when his name no longer belongs only to his own time, but to later arguments about identity, legitimacy, and what power should look like in a diverse empire. Aurangzeb carries exactly that burden. He is feared not just as an individual sovereign, but as a symbol of rule becoming less accommodating and more punitive. What keeps Aurangzeb haunting is that he reveals how terrifying conviction can become once placed inside imperial machinery. He did not need the theatrical madness of a Caligula or the flamboyant self-destruction of a Nero to leave fear behind. He only needed the throne, the army, the law, and the will to make all of them answer a harder vision of sovereignty. That is why his memory still carries weight. In Aurangzeb, monarchy appears not as excess, but as relentless pressure, and pressure applied across an empire can become one of the darkest forms of rule history remembers. Number 7. Commodus. Some rulers terrified history because they were cold and methodical, but others did something more destabilizing. They turned empire itself into a stage for vanity, appetite, and performance until power began to feel unreal in the most dangerous way. Commodus belongs to that darker category of imperial fear. Roman emperor and heir to a system built on military authority and political gravity, he survives in memory not as a guardian of imperial order, but as a figure who seemed to dissolve the seriousness of rule into spectacle. That is what gives him such enduring force. Commodus was not frightening simply because he was cruel. He was frightening because he made the empire look as though it had fallen into the hands of someone who wanted to perform power more than govern it. What makes Commodus so powerful in historical memory is the sense of degradation attached to his reign. Rome could endure hard rulers, brutal campaigns, and dynastic violence, but a ruler who made sovereignty feel theatrical in the wrong way threatened something deeper than policy. Under Commodus, the emperor no longer appeared only as military protector or political center. He began to appear as actor, gladiatorial fantasy, self-created image, and appetite made public. That matters because monarchy and empire are sustained partly by ritual seriousness. Once the ruler himself begins to corrode that seriousness, fear spreads differently. The court becomes unstable, legitimacy becomes absurd, and the state starts to feel exposed to the whims of one man's ego. This is why Commodus remains haunting. He embodies one of history's most unsettling truths about personal rule. Incompetence fused with absolute authority can become more corrosive than open savagery. A brutal tyrant may still understand the machinery he is abusing. A ruler who confuses that machinery with his own fantasy can make the whole imperial structure tremble. Commodus survives in memory precisely because he seemed to blur the line between emperor and self-mythologizing performer. Once that line collapses, every decree, every public appearance, and every punishment starts to feel less like governance and more like the mood swings of a crown detached from responsibility. What keeps Commodus haunting is that he represents monarchy at the point where self-indulgence becomes public danger. He terrified history not because he conquered too much or disciplined too harshly, but because he made supreme rule feel unserious and therefore unpredictable. In him, empire no longer appears as a hard machine directed by strategy. It appears as a vast body forced to mirror the instability of one man's desire to be adored, feared, and seen. That is why his name still carries such darkness. Commodus reminds history that a ruler does not need to be the strongest man in the room to become terrifying. Sometimes it is enough that no one can stop him from making the room answer his delusion. Number 6. Tamerlane. Some rulers terrified history because they governed from thrones, but others did something even more enduringly horrifying. They made conquest itself feel like an act of punishment inflicted on entire civilizations. Tamerlane belongs to that darker category of imperial fear. Conqueror, warlord, and founder of a vast but violently assembled empire, he survives in memory not merely as a successful military leader, but as a figure whose campaigns became synonymous with devastation on a scale meant to be remembered. That is what gives him such lasting force. He did not simply defeat enemies. He arranged destruction in ways that made cities, populations, and landscapes carry the message of his power long after the battle had ended. What makes Tamerlane so powerful in historical memory is the theatricality of terror attached to his conquests. Many rulers waged war, but not all understood so fully how to turn massacre and ruin into political language. Around Tamerlane's name gather stories of pyramids of skulls, annihilated populations, and conquered regions, reduced not only militarily, but psychologically. Whether every number and every image preserved by later chroniclers is exact is less important than the structure they reveal. Tamerlane became feared because violence under him appeared deliberately amplified into symbol. He did not want only submission. He wanted memory. That is often when conquest becomes legend. The ruler stops being measured merely in territory and starts being measured in the scale of fear he leaves behind. At the same time, Tamerlane's legacy is darker because it combines brutality with ambition of almost civilizational scope. He was not remembered as a local tyrant exhausting a small realm. He moved across major centers of power, breaking political orders and forcing whole regions to reckon with his will. This matters because the most terrifying rulers in history are often those who make the world around them feel temporarily lawless, as though the old structures have ceased to protect anyone once their armies arrive. Tamerlane carried that atmosphere. His campaigns seemed to announce that the distance between a thriving city and a place of death could be very short indeed when his power chose to close it. What keeps Tamerlane haunting is that he represents one of the purest historical forms of reign as terror. He was not simply a monarch administering fear within inherited borders. He was a conquering force whose authority expanded through devastation so memorable that later centuries could not speak his name without also invoking ruin. He terrified history because he proved that rule can be established not only through law, bloodline, or charisma, but through destruction arranged so systematically that it becomes the architecture of empire itself. Number 5. Leopold II. Some rulers terrified history because they raged visibly, but others did something colder and, in many ways, far worse. They turned distance into a shield behind which mass suffering could be organized in the language of civilization, progress, and administration. Leopold II belongs to that darker category of sovereign fear. King of Belgium, he did not become infamous mainly for what he did at the center of his own court, but for what was done in the Congo under his authority, where extraction, coercion, terror, and atrocity became inseparable from the political order he created. That is what gives him such enduring force. Leopold did not need to be remembered as a madman. He is remembered as something more unsettling, a ruler whose cruelty wore bureaucratic clothing. What makes Leopold II so powerful in historical memory is the moral split at the center of his reign. Publicly, empire could be wrapped in the language of philanthropy, order, and uplift. In practice, the system associated with his rule in the Congo became one of forced labor, mutilation, hostage-taking, killings, and mass human devastation linked to extraction and control. That contrast is exactly what makes his legacy so chilling. Some tyrants declare themselves through visible savagery. Leopold represents a more modern horror, the ruler who can speak the language of humanitarian purpose while presiding over mechanisms of suffering so large that they scar entire populations. In such a figure, monarchy becomes less theatrical and more industrial in its terror. That is why Leopold remains haunting. He reveals one of history's ugliest truths about power. Cruelty often becomes most effective when it is made administrative. The victims are far away, the profits are close, the paperwork exists, and the moral camouflage remains just strong enough for denial to survive while the system continues operating. This is fear transformed into policy rather than spectacle, and policy can outlast the moods of any individual ruler. Leopold's name still carries such darkness because he demonstrates that a sovereign need not personally wield the whip or blade in order to become inseparable from the suffering produced in his name. Distance does not dilute responsibility. In his case, it magnified the horror by making it easier to sustain. What keeps Leopold II haunting is that he represents monarchy stripped of chivalric illusion and exposed as ownership, extraction, and sanctioned terror on a colonial scale. He terrified history not through a momentary outburst, but through a system. That is what makes him one of the darkest rulers on this list. He reminds us that the most frightening reigns are not always those built on visible madness or battlefield blood alone. Sometimes they are the ones that turn human lives into units beneath a crown and make the suffering feel ordinary enough to continue. Number 4. Huang. Some rulers terrified history because they were remembered for visible cruelty, but others did something more profound and, in a different way, more frightening. They imposed order so absolutely that the state itself began to feel like an extension of one man's will. Huang belongs to that darker category of imperial power. As the first emperor of a unified China, he survives not merely as a founder, but as a figure whose greatness and fear are impossible to separate. That is what gives him such enduring force. He did not simply inherit a kingdom and rule it harshly. He remade the political world around him so completely that even his brutality became part of the architecture of state formation. What makes Qin Shi Huang so powerful in historical memory is the scale of his ambition. Standardization, centralization, massive construction, legal severity, suppression of dissent, and the pursuit of permanence all converge around his reign. This matters because some rulers become frightening not through instability, but through total design. Under Qin Shi Huang, power seems to lose softness altogether. The empire becomes measurable, disciplined, and unified, but also watched, punished, and tightened. That combination is one of the most unsettling things history can produce. Order itself begins to feel coercive, as though the ruler has decided that the only secure world is one in which variation, argument, and memory must all bend or break. His legend survives because founding power is often the most dangerous kind. Later rulers may inherit settled forms, but the founder operates at the point where law, punishment, and political imagination are still being welded together. Qin Shi Huang carries exactly that energy. He is remembered not just as a sovereign, but as a ruler who treated the human world as material to be shaped, disciplined, and fixed against disorder. In that sense, the fear attached to him is not only about cruelty, it is about scale. He appears as the kind of monarch for whom entire populations, traditions, and landscapes become objects inside a single imperial design. What keeps Qin Shi Huang haunting is that he reveals one of history's deepest fears about monarchy, that the ruler who creates the state may also become the one who teaches it how to terrify. He remains unforgettable because his reign sits at the threshold where greatness and oppression reinforce one another. In him, empire is born through force, memory is threatened by authority, and power seeks not merely obedience, but permanence. That is why his name still carries both awe and dread. He did not only found an empire, he made founding itself feel dangerous. Number 3. Nero. Some rulers terrified history because they were methodical, but others did something more destabilizing. They made the center of power feel theatrical, volatile, and morally unmoored, as though the empire were being forced to live inside one man's appetites. Nero belongs to that darker category of imperial fear. Roman emperor and one of the most infamous names in all of antiquity, he survives not simply as a cruel ruler, but as a figure whose reign became inseparable from spectacle, suspicion, and the collapse of seriousness at the very top of the state. That is what gives him such enduring force. Nero is not remembered only for violence. He is remembered for turning power itself into performance. What makes Nero so powerful in historical memory is the mixture of indulgence and danger that surrounds him. Many emperors were ruthless, but Nero's legacy carries something more corrosive. The sense that the imperial office had become emotionally unstable, capable of drifting from artistry to punishment, self-display to paranoia, pleasure to lethal accusation. That instability matters because monarchy depends heavily on ritual confidence. Once the ruler begins to behave as though the empire exists partly to reflect his impulses, fear spreads differently. The court becomes uncertain, loyalty becomes dangerous, and political life begins to revolve around mood, vanity, and the threat of sudden destruction. Nero survives in memory because he seems to embody that shift perfectly. His reputation was sharpened by hostile sources, and that must always be remembered. Roman writers had every reason to shape his image into a moral nightmare, especially after his fall. But even with that caution, the broader structure of his legend remains immensely powerful. Nero became the kind of ruler later ages use as shorthand for imperial corruption, decadent cruelty, and self-obsession fused with command. Fires, executions, artistic vanity, family bloodshed, and punitive paranoia gathered around his name until he ceased to be simply a historical emperor and became almost a literary form of dread. That is one of the clearest signs a ruler has terrified history beyond his own lifetime. What keeps Nero haunting is that he represents monarchy at the point where image and violence begin feeding each other. He terrified history not because he was the strongest emperor Rome ever had, but because he made supreme power feel emotionally unsafe. In him, empire no longer appears as a stern machine of law or conquest. It appears as a stage on which one man can perform desire while others pay the cost. That is why Nero remains so unforgettable. He reminds history that a ruler does not need to be purely efficient to become terrifying. Sometimes it is enough that the entire state must endure the consequences of his need to be seen, adored, obeyed, and feared at once. Number 2. Ivan the Terrible. Some rulers terrified history because they inherited unstable worlds, but others became terrifying because they responded to instability by making fear itself a method of rule. Ivan the Terrible belongs to that darker category of sovereign power. First Tsar of Russia and one of the most infamous rulers in the country's history, he survives not simply as a monarch of expansion and state-building, but as a figure whose reign became saturated with suspicion, punishment, and violence so personal that the state seemed to acquire his temperament. That is what gives him such enduring force. Ivan did not merely govern through harshness, he made harshness feel intimate, as though the crown had developed nerves and rage of its own. What makes Ivan so powerful in historical memory is the fusion of political centralization with psychological terror. Many rulers punish rebellion and crush opposition, but Ivan's legend endures because punishment under him appeared to move beyond necessity and into atmosphere. The oprichnina, the cultivated climate of dread, the theatrical displays of vengeance, and the willingness to turn even the elite into objects of fear all contributed to an image of monarchy that no longer relied only on obedience. It relied on unpredictability. That is one of the darkest forms of rule. A king may be cruel and still remain legible. A king who makes everyone wonder whether they are safe under his gaze becomes something more corrosive. He turns the court into a place where loyalty no longer guarantees survival. This is part of why Ivan remains haunting. He embodies a truth history has never found comforting, that state formation and terror can advance together. He was not simply a mad tyrant raging in isolation from politics. He was also a ruler involved in real questions of empire, legitimacy, and Russian power, which makes his cruelty more disturbing, not less. The violence cannot be filed away as mere personal collapse. It becomes entangled with the making of a stronger state, and once that happens, the fear attached to the ruler deepens. History is forced to ask whether terror was an accident of his reign or one of its tools. In Ivan's case, the answer seems dangerously close to both. What keeps Ivan the Terrible haunting is that he represents monarchy at the point where personal dread and political design become difficult to separate. He terrified history because he made the sovereign seem not like a distant father of the realm, but like an injured, watchful force capable of striking inward against his own world with devastating intensity. In him, the crown ceases to be a symbol of order alone. It becomes the center of a system in which fear is both emotion and policy. That is why his name still carries such weight. He reminds history that some rulers do not merely preside over terror. They teach the state how to wear it. Number 1. Caligula. Some rulers terrified history because they built empires through force, but others became unforgettable because they made power itself feel insane, theatrical, and unpredictably intimate. Caligula stands at number 1 because no other ruler on this list so completely embodies the historical nightmare of absolute authority, detached from restraint, proportion, and recognizable human limit. Roman emperor and one of antiquity's most infamous figures, he survives not simply as a bad ruler, but as a symbol of what happens when supreme power becomes inseparable from humiliation, whim, cruelty, and spectacle. That is what gives him unmatched force. Caligula is not remembered only for violence. He is remembered for making rule itself feel deranged. What makes Caligula so powerful in historical memory is the way his name condenses every aristocratic fear about monarchy into one figure. Around him gather stories of humiliation, sadism, arbitrary execution, sexual transgression, divine pretension, and a court forced to orbit the moods of a ruler who no longer seemed bound by any stable relation to dignity, law, or reality. Historians rightly warn that the ancient sources are hostile, sensational, and shaped by political agendas, and that caution matters. But it does not erase the larger truth of his legend. Caligula became terrifying because even the exaggerations chosen against him reveal what later memory found most frightening in a ruler. Not only cruelty, but the total collapse of measure. That is why he remains more haunting than many overt conquerors. A savage warlord from beyond the frontier threatens the body of the state. Caligula threatens its meaning. Under such a ruler, power no longer appears as disciplined command or even stern oppression. It appears as a kind of personal theatre in which everyone else is forced to participate without knowing where humiliation will end and death will begin. That uncertainty is one of the deepest political terrors history can preserve. The problem is not only that the ruler is dangerous, it is that danger has become irrational enough to escape prediction. Courts can learn to live under severity. They cannot truly rest under whim. What makes Caligula worthy of the #1 place is that he represents the purest historical image of monarchy turned into psychological terror. He terrified history because he made the emperor seem less like a sovereign and more like a force before which all ordinary boundaries had dissolved, the boundary between ruler and god, punishment and entertainment, law and appetite, public office and private obsession. Whether every story about him is true in literal detail matters less than why the stories survived. They survived because Caligula became the name history uses when it wants to express the fear that absolute power, once detached from restraint, does not merely become cruel, it becomes surreal, and surreal cruelty, backed by a throne, is one of the darkest things the political imagination has ever known.